To the Record, I'm Katrina Szish, in for Greta Van Susteren. We begin in our nation's capital, where the future of health care in America faced two votes today, the dual plans, one from Republicans, the other from Democrats. They both hit dead ends. Premiums are set to rise for millions as Obamacare subsidies face their expiration date. So what happens now? The other big news we're following, the oil tanker seized from Venezuela. President Trump says we're keeping the oil. Today, the White House gave an update on the vessel.
The vessel will go to a U.S. port, and the United States does intend to seize the oil. However, there is a legal process for the seizure of that oil, and that legal process will be followed.
And speaking of Venezuela, she wore a wig and a disguise to sneak out of the country. Today, Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado popped out from months of hiding, speaking on the other side of the world.
I don't think they have known where I have been, and certainly they would have done everything to stop me from coming here.
The man charged with murdering Charlie Kirk appears in court for the very first time. We'll tell you what happened inside that courtroom and where some Democrats are throwing cash, including AOC's lavish trip to Puerto Rico and another congressman's questionable purchase of Netflix stock. Also ahead, an 88-year-old U.S. veteran who lost almost everything. Well, he's celebrating a miracle thanks to the generosity of strangers from around the world. But first, to the White House, where Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt revealed the next steps after the U.S. seized an oil tanker off of Venezuela. White House correspondent Mike Carter is following the latest. Mike, what have you learned?
Hey, Katrina, good afternoon. Well, Venezuela is calling the U.S. seizure of a tanker off its coast yesterday a, quote, act of international piracy and blatant theft. Now, of course, Venezuela is home to some of the world's largest proven oil reserves. It's accusing Washington now of seeking to steal its natural oil resources. But the U.S. Treasury Department previously had sanctioned the seized tanker back in 2022 for its alleged involvement in oil smuggling that generated revenue for Hezbollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Iran. The U.S. Maritime Administration, that's part of the Department of Transportation, says the vessel was falsely flying the Guyana flag, I should say, at the time of its seizure and is not registered in that country. Today, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt answering questions about why that tanker was seized.
Trump administration is focused on doing many things in the Western Hemisphere. The president has taken a new approach that has not been taken by any administration for quite some time to actually focus on what's going on in our own backyard. And there are two things that are very important to this administration. Number one, stopping the flow of illegal drugs into the United States of America, which we know has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. He's also fully committed to effectuating this administration's sanction policy, and that's what you saw and the world saw take place yesterday.
All right, and Ukraine has responded to President Trump's latest peace proposal. Volodymyr Zelensky saying today that the Trump administration and Ukraine hope to reach an agreement, a full understanding, quote unquote, by Christmas. Now, Karoline Leavitt in today's White House press briefing talking about a planned meeting between European officials and Ukraine in Paris on Saturday, saying it's still up in the air whether the U.S. will take part. We'll see what this detailed response to President Trump's peace proposal by Ukraine, if it does warrant a response by the U.S. We should know that at some point tomorrow. Katrina?
Yeah, Mike, great reporting there. And again, a lot going on right now, but particularly we saw so much surrounding Venezuela regarding drugs and narco-terrorists, and all of a sudden now it has become all about oil. What are you hearing, even some chatter behind the scenes that maybe we haven't heard about this next focus on the country?
Well, you know, the chatter now and what a lot of reporters are wondering here at the White House is, does the seizure of this tanker, is this indeed an escalation, and does it warrant possible higher conflict with the country of Venezuela? Are we going to see land strikes, as the president said that he may be open to doing? White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt today not even going there, basically saying that this tanker was taken, it was seized, but don't make any illusions, don't take this as an act of escalation, that this tanker had every right to be seized. It was flying a false flag, and that because of those dealings with Iran, with Hezbollah, having that tanker being sanctioned back in 2022, that this was kind of a one-off thing. And even though the U.S. has been building up its military presence in the Caribbean Sea over the last few months, that make no mistake that this is a separate issue than what we're dealing with those drug regimes in Venezuela.
Mike, it was funny when President Trump was asked, what are you going to do with the oil? He said, keep it, I guess. Of course, a lot of people chuckling, but I know that the press secretary did say that, of course, the vessel will be moved to a U.S. port if it hasn't been already, and everything will be done according to laws that are already in place before anybody goes crazy about Trump stole oil. We know Maduro was saying it was an act of piracy, but to your point, again, it was a sanctioned boat, so the U.S. was well within its rights. While I still have you, Mike, want to get your thoughts on that Christmas potential deadline for Putin's war in Ukraine. Again, the chatter on the ground, always my favorite part to ask about.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of deadlines, right, when it comes to the war in Ukraine. The president very fond of saying, well, no more in 2 to 3 weeks. So, look, Volodymyr Zelensky saying today that the White House wants to have this wrapped up by Christmas. Now, that is almost definitely a soft deadline. And again, President yesterday holding talks with European officials in a phone call, and Ukraine responding today to that latest peace proposal. Will they concede territory to Russia? That is the biggest point of contention in this peace plan. And up until now, Volodymyr Zelensky has said that is just simply not negotiable. There may be some movement there, and if there is, we may see Marco Rubio or Steve Witkoff heading to Paris this weekend. But, when it comes to deadlines in the Trump administration, Katrina, those are always moving deadlines, it seems like. But we'll see. There's something could come together this weekend. And who knows, in the next 2 weeks, we may have something coming together.
Mike, do you get a sense that President Trump is getting frustrated that Vladimir Putin didn't just quickly acquiesce to multiple deal suggestions?
Well, I don't know if it's Vladimir Putin necessarily that the president is frustrated at, more so than Volodymyr Zelensky, Katrina. Obviously, President Trump has long said that he thought this would be the easiest war of the 8 or 9 wars that he's solved so far. It's turned out to be one of the most difficult. I think the blame or the disgruntlement on behalf of the president is equally placed between Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, Ukraine needing to give up territory, it seems like, for this peace proposal to come together is something that it's been unwilling to do. President Trump wants to get this thing done. He wants to finalize this. He wants another win by year's end. I think the president's frustrations is with both Putin and Zelensky at this moment.
Very, very interesting. And of course, however, though, I would think if Ukraine, of course, agrees to give up some of that land, that territory, that almost signals a win for Putin. And of course, he is the bad actor in all of this. But again, peace is a good thing. And I know the president wants to stop the killing. We will wait and see, hopefully soon. Yeah.
And Katrina, we heard yesterday the president saying, pleading with Ukraine, or asking the question, I should say, when are you going to hold elections? It's been several years now that Volodymyr Zelensky has not been democratically elected. So folks are wondering, the president is wondering, when is Ukraine going to hold another election? If the majority of people in Ukraine want a negotiation to the end of this war and the government is unwilling to give that, that's another bone of contention with President Trump and Zelensky.
That's right. Of course, those wartime rules, not having elections. But again, I believe Zelensky said, OK, let's do it. Mike Carter, always great intel from you. Thank you so much, and stay warm down there.
Good to see you, Katrina.
All right. And today, a federal judge in Maryland ordered Kilmeny Abrego Garcia to be immediately released from ICE detention. The judge says he was detained without legal authority. Now, this comes as Abrego Garcia challenges his deportation to another third country. The Department of Homeland Security slammed the judge's decision today to release him. DHS spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin wrote on X, quote, "This is naked judicial activism by an Obama-appointed judge. This order lacks any valid legal basis, and we will continue to fight this tooth and nail in the courts." Meantime, also today, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, she was on Capitol Hill testifying before the House Homeland Security Committee. One of the highlights, perhaps, was her exchange with Democrat Benny Thompson about the shooting of National Guard members in D.C. last month. Watch what happened.
Reference the unfortunate accident that occurred with the National Guardsman being killed.
You think that was an unfortunate accident?
I mean,
It was a terrorist attack.
Wait. Look, I'll get it straight. Then you can
He shot our National Guardsman in the head.
Look, Mr. Chairman, will you direct the witness to allow me to ask my question? It was an unfortunate situation, but you blamed it solely on Joe Biden. I want you to know who approved the asylum application for this same person.
Mr. Thompson, this individual that came into the country.
No, I want to know who approved.
Congressman Thompson, I want you to understand. When this individual came into the country, he came under evacuation of Afghanistan under Operation Allies Welcome, was thoroughly vetted by the Biden administration at that point in time, allowed into our country, and then was never followed up. I want to remind everybody in Congress.
Reclaim my time.
We follow the law. And every asylum is supposed to have a check-in every single year, and the Biden administration failed to do that. They vetted this individual, allowed them into our country, and did not do due diligence.
Witness will allow the gentleman to ask his question.
Yes or no? Who approved the asylum claim?
The application on the asylum was thoroughly filled out by information that was gathered by the Biden administration.
Also, during the hearing, some Democrats called on Noem to resign, and at one point she responded with this: "I will consider your asking me to resign as an endorsement of my work," end quote. And coming up, Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro is not happy with the United States. We're going to tell you why when the record continues. Stay right there.
Come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant, O come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of angels. O come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord.
My husband is Miguel Cervantes, who was a firefighter with the Rancho Cucamonga Fire District. That's what he absolutely loved. My husband's cancer is directly related to his service as a firefighter. My immediate thought after he was gone was, how am I going to do this? Tunnel to Towers said that it would be their honor to help me out by covering my mortgage. To say that it's been a weight lifted off my shoulder would be an understatement.
Joining us is Dr. Drew from the Wellness Company with advice for dealing with seasonal colds and flu. Doctor?
Cold and flu season is here, and every year you or a loved one gets sick. Your doctor can't see you. Waiting in a crowded urgent care is brutal. This is a particularly bad cold and flu season, and it's why doctors suggest every family needs an emergency medical kit. Your medical emergency kit is filled with essential prescriptions. It includes antibiotics like generic Z-Pak to get well faster, amoxicillin for pneumonia, strep throat, ear infections, plus prescriptions for nausea and UTIs, and even ivermectin. It's easy. Just match your symptoms to the prescription in your guidebook or call the telemedicine doctor standing by. Take your medication early and feel better faster. Having a medical emergency kit is like having an urgent care in your home. No waiting to see a doctor, no lines at the pharmacy.
Smart advice. We've shared the website and discount code below to save viewers $45. Order now and your kit will be rushed to your door. Thank you, doctor.
Welcome back to The Record. I'm Katrina Szish, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro is slamming the United States for seizing an oil tanker off the Caribbean coast. Now, the Venezuelan government releasing this statement that reads in part, quote, "This act of piracy not only constitutes a flagrant violation of international law, but also represents an unacceptable aggression against Venezuela's national sovereignty, right to free trade, and freedom of navigation. Furthermore, this attack poses a threat to all the peoples of our region, jeopardizing the peace and stability we hold dear," end quote. Attorney General Pam Bondi says the oil tanker was, quote, "used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran." Bondi also writing, quote, for multiple years, the oil tanker has been sanctioned by the United States due to its involvement in an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations, end quote. And this afternoon, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt discussed the next steps in the investigation.
Well, what I can tell you right now, the vessel has been seized, as you know, and the Department of Justice did that in conjunction with the Coast Guard and the Department of War. The vessel is currently undergoing a forfeiture process right now. The United States currently has a full investigative team on the ground on the vessel, and individuals on board the vessel are being interviewed, and any relevant evidence is being seized. With respect to the oil, that's a different issue. As you know, Peter, the vessel will go to a U.S. port, and the United States does intend to seize the oil. However, there is a legal process for the seizure of that oil, and that legal process will be followed.
Let's bring in senior fellow at Atlantic Council and former Pentagon official Alex Plitsas and director of American Military Project and former Army Ranger Will Thibeau. Gentlemen, welcome to The Record. Let's dive in on this. We know that we have been hearing a lot about Venezuela over the past couple weeks, but this time it's a little different because we're not talking about narco-terrorism boats. We're talking about an oil tanker. Alex, tell me how this changes things, or does it?
Sure. I think it's meant to put more pressure on the Maduro regime. It's very clear that they were hoping that they were going to de-escalate and they were going to be able to simply have Maduro leave and have his underlings remain and granted amnesty, which was largely seen as an extension of him still running the country, which was a non-starter for the administration. So this is a clear signal that the administration is upping the ante here. As you just mentioned, the narco boats have been the targets to date, but as of yesterday, that state oil that's coming out of there, 1.1 to 1.8 million barrels of oil that was being used to help fund the regime, and that boat in particular had been used to fund Iran and terrorist groups in the Middle East. So it was a smart move by the administration, well overdue, and I'm glad they took it.
Yeah, Will, obviously, I think there's something to be said for actually fighting transgressions to our own laws in our own backyard, particularly. This was a sanctioned ship. It was carrying oil to terrorists that would support Hezbollah and others. And so we would be fully within our rights, I would understand, to actually take out this boat. But also oil, we know, is of crucial importance to Maduro's rule.
Oh, well, that's exactly right, Katrina. And I think that's the most important part of Attorney General Pam Bondi's statement. This was sanctioned oil that has been sanctioned for a long time. But just now, with Trump administration resolve, the U.S. military is taking action to enforce sanctions that we put in place. Sanctions are not some digital, fiat method of punishment. They are enforced by U.S. military hard power and U.S. economic power. And so this I think is finally some credibility and some wasta behind U.S. foreign policy. This is the implementation of the Trump administration national security strategy. Again, it's always funny that there's a lot of hemming and hawing about the enforcement of our foreign policy priorities when those priorities are in the Western Hemisphere, in our own backyard. But you never see this scrutiny. You never see, Democrats lose their mind when this happens overseas. This is what President Trump means when he says the Western Hemisphere is the priority for this administration. Like Alex said, it's long overdue, and we shouldn't be surprised. This is what it means to have a foreign policy that is backed, enforced, and credible by the Trump administration.
Alex, do you think that this will potentially hurt Maduro's rule, particularly if President Trump continues to go after his oil business, his, I would say, illicit oil business, because really that is all that Maduro has to go on, of course, besides the drugs coming from his country. So do you think this is President Trump attempting to really try to put an end to his leadership?
As I was saying previously, I think it's definitely, more influence to try to get him to step down, because I think the president would prefer to avoid military conflict. He could. He clearly wants Maduro to go. I think he's arrived at that conclusion. But if he won't do it on his own, then actions will be taken in the future. And this is one step to help force it. So if you think of it logically, the narco boats to start, and now we're talking state assets. The next thing would be potential strikes inside the country. We don't see any major ground forces lined up in the area here, but we do see the Marine Expeditionary Unit, roughly 1/3 of the deployed U.S. Navy off the coast or in the Caribbean within striking distance, plus fighter jets and bombers. So collectively, it speaks to air and missile attacks, potentially targeted special operations missions, and then Marines to help secure sites. So there must be some sort of ground component inside of Venezuela, which is not hard to see, given the fact that Maduro is so unpopular. And lastly, I think, directly to your point, this is a socialist dictator who ran South America's wealthiest economy into the ground, and oil is a mainstay of the economy there. And quite frankly, if the president continues to seize these ships, which is well within his right to do if they're under sanctions, it is eventually going to hurt. It's just a question of how much time. So again, I think the administration made the right decision here. Hopefully Maduro will step down, but if not, I think the president and the administration are prepared to do what's necessary.
Will, about that oil, we know the president, when asked, well, what do you do with it? He said, well, I guess we keep it. And our White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said, well, yeah, I guess we will keep it. Of course, everything will be processed and reviewed according to the laws, as she also stated today. But out of curiosity, what does happen to this oil, or what is legally or geopolitically acceptable in this kind of case?
I hope I can fill up my car with this refined oil into gasoline in a few weeks. And this is the thing. We talk about international law as if it is some, sacrosanct covenant that the United States, must follow and obey at every turn. In reality, we should treat international law like American priorities. It is, of course, acceptable and good to adhere to norms that govern an international community. But for too long, America has been the only nation that follows international law. And so I think the Trump administration is doing their best to adhere to the proper processes by which we do seize this oil. But it should be our oil. This was a direct violation, flying in the face of the Trump administration's credibility. And they seized this tanker because we're in charge of the Western Hemisphere. And, Nicolas Maduro is not going to continue to fleet our sanctions and our credibility like he has, for years now. And so, I do hope we do the right thing, and I do hope we respect norms to the extent we can. But let's not hold ourselves to the highest possible standard at the expense of enforcing our interests and, turning a blind eye to the fact that no one else follows international law to this extent. So let's make sure the American interests is what defines the laws that we make, the sanctions that we enforce. And that's what I think President Trump has done.
Alex, what do you think?
I think we've been very fortunate. I mean, one of the reasons that the Iranians didn't close the Straits of Hormuz is that the U.S. doesn't really rely on Gulf oil anymore. We've become, largely energy independent or well on our way to getting there at some point, with minimal imports. And so it really means that we don't necessarily need the oil ourselves. So whether we're going to keep it and use it here domestically, as was just mentioned, or if we're going to sell it and then, keep the proceeds for the next Venezuelan government that comes in, the one that was actually democratically elected by the people who are there. In either case, that money is not going to the Maduro regime, so it can continue to fund terrorism. And one piece that Americans aren't really tracking is that there are a number of hostile foreign intelligence services who send their most junior folks to go establish their credentials overseas and their backstories, so then they can then go from those countries to a place like the United States, where they show up as somebody from South America, not necessarily from Russia or somewhere else. So they've been cooperating not only with terrorist groups, but also hostile intelligence services that seek to do the United States harm. It is time for this regime to go. The administration is taking the proper actions, and this is a great first step.
Okay, and of course, President Trump has made it very clear that this will not continue, either the drugs and now, of course, the sanctioned oil. Alex Plitsas, Will Thibeau, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina.
Today, Venezuelan opposition leader Corina Machado was reunited with her family after being in hiding for almost a year. She also spoke to the public. She waved to supporters at a hotel in Norway's capital just hours after her daughter accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on her behalf. Here is part of what Machado had to say.
I am very hopeful Venezuela will be free, and we will turn a country into a beacon of hope and opportunity of democracy. And we will welcome not only the Venezuelans that have been forced to flee, but citizens from all over the world that will find a refuge, as Venezuela used to be decades ago.
You may be wondering how Machado escaped Venezuela to get to Norway. Well, according to the Wall Street Journal, It was a journey. The Journal writes, quote, wearing a wig and a disguise, Maria Corina Machado began her escape from Venezuela on Monday afternoon. Over the course of 10 nerve-wracking hours, Machado and 2 people helping her escape hit 10 military checkpoints, avoiding capture each time before she reached the coast by midnight, said a person close to the operation. She rested for a few hours, the person said, before the next leg of her journey, a perilous trip across the open Caribbean Sea to Curacao. End quote. And earlier this year, our very own Greta Van Susteren sat down with Maria Corina Machado. Here's part of that interview.
We're committed to keep on fighting until the end. Venezuela will be free and will be the best partner of the United States in this region.
We're glad she's home safely. And coming up, the Senate failing to pass both the Democrats' and Republicans' health care bills with only days left until Obamacare subsidies expire. That when the record continues.
Hi, I'm Charlotte McBride. I love working at Newsmax because every day we bring you honest reporting with real conversations, no spin. We're not telling you how to think. We're just giving you the facts and letting you decide what's best for you and your family.
Hello, everyone. It's President Donald J. Trump, and it's Trump time. Check out this red beauty. It's one of my new watches. Wear it proudly on your wrist, and everyone will know exactly what it's for, who it represents. It's really going to be something special. It's for your favorite president. Get your watch today at gettrumpwatches.com. These make a great gift. It's Trump time.
JB Smoove, what are you doing here?
I'm always here. And you're here for that handsome lanky man club meeting.
No, I'm shooting a consumer cellular commercial. You know, we should get you signed up.
Aren't I too young?
We got deals for people over 50. That's you. Same reliable coverage.
That sounds great. Sign me up. But I went in on that handsome lanky man club. I'm handsome. I'm lanky.
See how we can cut your bill. And right now, get your second month free. Call Consumer Cellular.
Make it happen, Teddy.
It's the Blue Compass RV annual Blue Tag clearance. Save over 40% on select new RVs during our largest sale of the year. Plus, every RV comes with a 1-year VIP membership to RV Complete, a $5,000 value. Visit us online or in store today.
Nobody does insurance like the zebra.
Okay. Got you, Mike.
I just found the perfect policy at the best price for you.
Told you. Nobody does insurance like the zebra. We monitor your insurance and inform you of savings the moment we find it, so you never have to second guess your policy or your price. Find out how much you can save today. Hooves in.
From drained investment accounts and stolen tax returns to lost wages and hiring lawyers, identity theft can cost you more than you might think. That's why only LifeLock offers the $1 Million Protection Package, which covers stolen funds, experts and lawyers, and out-of-pocket expenses up to $3 million in total. Don't face the high cost of identity theft alone. Protect your future and finances with LifeLock. Join today.
They killed her brother. They shot her dog. And they took her hostage for 400 days and terrifying nights. They raped her. They put guns to her head. They starved her. These are the stories of Israeli women attacked by Hamas. If you are supporting Hamas and radicalized Palestinians, this is what you are supporting. Choose freedom, not terror.
Not again.
Your cold is coming! Your cold is coming!
Thanks, Revere.
We really need to keep Zycam in the house.
Only if you want to shorten your cold. When you feel a cold coming, shorten it with Zycam.
Look what I just found. No ding decline on the Experian app. They show me credit cards that won't hurt my credit if I'm not approved. Turns out I care about my credit health too. Get the app from your big financial friend. Experian.
Welcome to The Record. I'm Katrina Szish in for Greta Van Susteren. Today, the Senate voted on 2 separate plans addressing health care. Both proposals failed. One put forward by the Democrats, the other put forward by Republicans. Now, these plans were aimed at addressing a rise in health care costs that are expected to take effect for 21 million people who are enrolled in Obamacare subsidies. And Obamacare subsidies expire at the end of the month. Congressional correspondent Kilmeny Duchardt has the very latest. Kilm.
Both of those bills blocked in the Senate, failing to clear those procedural hurdles, needing that 60 votes to advance. The first was the GOP proposal. That was 51 to 48. That would have added money to the health savings accounts of Americans. That was put forward by Republican Senator Bill Cassidy. Well, as did the Democratic proposal for that clean 3-year extension. That failed, but it was more bipartisan. Republican Senators Josh Hawley, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Dan Sullivan all voted with Democrats in favor. The White House has signaled it may not tackle the issue until next year. I asked the Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune about his engagement with the administration and where the issue will move from here. What have you heard from the president about this?
Well, I mean, the White House, as you know, has been, they've got their, I think, their own views on this, but we've been working with them. We work with them every day.
What's next after these fail?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think we have a lot of people, and I've expressed this, and so have many of my colleagues, the Democrats, a willingness to sit down and figure out if there's a path forward that includes reforms. And there are some Democrats who are interested in reforms. But I think what the Democrat leadership has insisted that whoever wants to do real reforms stand down and allow them to get this political issue.
The White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt says they're engaged on the issue, but stopped short of saying whether that would include extending those subsidies.
The president and Republicans are currently coming up with creative solutions and ideas to lower health care costs for the American people, and you'll continue to hear more from them on that.
But the Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says this was the Senate's last opportunity to act.
Republicans just blocked the Democrats' bill for a clean, simple extension of the ACA tax credits. The last chance they had to ensure people's premiums do not skyrocket in the coming months. Democrats did the work, but now Republicans chose the consequences.
All eyes right now are on House Democratic leadership to see what their plan is. There are 3 discharge petitions floating in the House, which the House is expected to take up next week. It's unclear if there will be bipartisan support for any of them to tackle this issue, with just 5 legislative days to go before the winter recess. Back to you.
All right, Kilmeny Duchardt on Capitol Hill. Thank you. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a massive defense policy act that authorizes $901 billion in annual military spending. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, moves to the Senate floor. That is where it is expected to be voted on next week. Now, that $901 billion in defense spending is actually $8 billion more than President Donald Trump requested earlier this year. One person who is not happy about the bill, or at least part of it, is National Transportation Safety Chair Jennifer Hominy. Watch.
The NTSB vehemently opposes Section 373 of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. This section, to the lay reader, is drafted to seemingly enhance safety. I want to be very clear that it does not in any way enhance safety. In fact, it reverses safety changes made after the mid-air collision, after issuance of our urgent safety recommendations, after the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, rightfully implemented our urgent safety recommendations and essentially gives the military unfettered access to the crowded and complex D.C. airspace.
All right. Meanwhile, an update to a story we brought you last week. We told you about 88-year-old veteran Ed Bombas, who was working full-time at a supermarket after losing his pension. His wife had also died, and he had to sell his home. Well, now he is able to retire after an influencer brought his story to the world. Strangers from all over donated to help him, and then Bombas was presented with a $1.7 million check. That money is expected to help pay off debts and retire. and hopefully relax. We're super happy to hear that great news. See, people are positive and come together to help others. That is some good news. And still ahead, there's also some outrage. It's our outrage of the day, and it involves congressional stock trading. You're not going to want to miss it. Stay with us. That when the record continues.
Hey, it's Mark Lauder. My career's taken me from the State House to the White House, campaigns for mayor, all the way to President of the United States. I came to Newsmax to help our viewers get more than the headlines, beyond the spin. It's a perspective you'll only see on Newsmax.
Not again. Your cold is coming! Your cold is coming!
Thanks, Revere.
We really need to keep Zycam in the house.
Only if you want to shorten your cold. When you feel a cold coming, shorten it with Zycam.
Elmer Heinrich here. I'm in the mineral and nutritional supplement business, and I'm here to tell you that there's hundreds of nutritional supplements on the market, but very few have more than 8 or 9 minerals. Now, you might consider Immuno 150. This incredible product has 70 plant-derived minerals and 80 other nutrients. Now, minerals are the most important of all nutrients, but due to topsoil mineral depletion, our present-day foods have 70% fewer minerals than many years ago. I believe the world is sick due to a lack of mineral in our food, so think about Immuno 150. There's nothing like it, and I mean nothing. Now, 70 minerals can do wonders to improve your health. Look at the videos on our website and consider placing an order for Immuno 150 online or call our toll-free number. See what 70 minerals and 80 of the best nutrients can do for you. Like thousands of others, you won't believe the results. Order now.
I am a coach and an alum of Girls on the Run. Kids today carry a lot of stress, from school pressure to social isolation to overuse of devices. We create a space where girls can connect, build confidence, and learn skills like managing emotions, setting goals, and speaking up. Each child's experience is different, and families need support. I'm proud to be part of a comprehensive solution to youth mental health. Get involved today at EmpowerOurFutureCoalition.com.
There are only a few men I'd trust with my life. 2 of them built this wallet. I've known the guys behind Proof for nearly 20 years, and we've been through hell and back together. When they told me they were building the wallet, I just said, bill me now, I'm in. This isn't some fashion piece. This isn't just some trend. These wallets are a direct reflection of the kind of men who built it. It's built to last, built to function, and designed to carry everything you need and more. If anything happens to it, they'll take care of it. No questions, no fine print. If you knew the guys who created this wallet, you wouldn't carry anything else. Go check them out, because they built this thing right.
You woke up with a sore throat and a low-grade fever. You know you are getting sick, so here's your choices. You can get sicker and miss work, try to see a doctor this week, or sit hours in a crowded waiting room at urgent care.
I have a smarter option for you. Open your medical emergency kit. Match your symptoms to doctor-recommended prescription in your booklet and take the right meds now and get well faster.
This is not a first aid kit. It's like having an urgent care in your home. It includes doctor-prescribed medications to treat over 39 medical issues like respiratory infections, strep throat, pneumonia, UTIs, and more.
No waiting to see the doctor and no standing in line at the pharmacy. It's right here.
Every home should have at least one medical emergency kit, and here's how to order.
Order online and save $45. Your kit to treat dozens of common and serious illnesses is rushed to your door. Visit urgentcarekit.com/news, promo code NEWS. That's urgentcarekit.com/news, promo code NEWS.
The United States and the Trump administration continues to be very much engaged in trying to bring the Russia-Ukraine war to an end. The President had a call with Europeans yesterday. His special envoy Witkoff and his team continue to talk with both sides literally as we speak. If there is a real chance of signing a peace agreement, if we feel like those meetings are worthy of someone on the United States' time this weekend, then we will send a representative.
Today, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt gave an update on the Russia-Ukraine war. So, are we any closer to a peace deal? Foreign correspondent Shelby Wilder is live in Kyiv with the very latest. Shelby.
Hi, Katrina. Yeah, after consulting with European allies, we know that Ukraine had delivered its point-by-point response to the Trump administration's latest peace proposal this week. But Ukrainian and European leaders warn they are under intense pressure from Washington to swiftly accept a deal, even though it appears that draft would include territorial losses for Ukraine and what critics say are other concessions to Russia. President Zelensky said today that the U.S. is pushing Ukraine to withdraw its forces from the Donbass, which is land Ukraine currently holds, and the U.S. seeks to create a demilitarized zone, or a free economic zone, as it was being called. Zelensky said Ukraine has no clarity right now on who would govern this demilitarized zone. And Zelensky stressed that Ukraine does not consider the proposal fair without ironclad guarantees that Russian troops would not simply move in and seize the area after Ukraine pulls back. Zelensky tonight said if one side's troops have to retreat, he means the Ukrainians, and the other side, Russia, stays where they are, then what will stop those Russian troops from advancing or disguising themselves as civilians and taking over the territory? Because that's precisely what happened in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. Zelensky said that even if Ukraine were to accept such an agreement, elections or a referendum would be required to ratify it. So at this stage, it appears highly unlikely Ukraine could agree to these terms, given the risk, but also without having further information with these looming questions, again, on this big sticking points. As for what's next, we know that Volodymyr Zelensky and his team held another discussion with Donald Trump's most important envoys today. That includes Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and 3 U.S. military officials, along with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, all being present on that call. Otherwise, senior U.S. officials are still expected to meet on Saturday in Paris with officials from Ukraine, France, Germany, and the UK to discuss the proposal further. And that meeting will be to try and reach a unified position on President Trump's revised 20-point peace plan. But it comes at a moment of significant strain between the U.S. and its European allies. Katrina?
Shelby, I have to ask, it seems difficult to expect or demand that Ukraine actually cede territory when they were aggressively attacked by Vladimir Putin. It almost seems like you're rewarding rather bad behavior. And, I think this is something that may be getting lost in this peace process. I understand we want an end to this war. We want an end to the killing. But to me, by almost giving Putin what he wants, it sounds like you're just opening the door for a future more intense invasion when Putin decides he's ready.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what the Ukrainians and Europeans have said is, let's do a demilitarized zone on the current line of contact. But this whole sticking point is the Donbass, specifically the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, that Russia wants to take full control of. But Kiev still currently holds about 20 to 30% of, with hundreds of thousands of people there. I was just there earlier this week. And so now the refined, initially the U.S. told Ukraine, listen, you need to leave that whole area and then Russia will agree to end the war. The Ukrainians and Europeans said no. They refined this peace agreement. Now the U.S. has come back and said, let's make it a demilitarized zone. But still, Kiev, you'll have to pull back your forces. And Ukraine rightfully fears that Russia would move into that demilitarized zone and take it over, because Putin has said repeatedly in the last few weeks he's not going to stop till he has all of the Donbass. So Ukraine says, why should we believe him now? So again, looming security guarantees and major questions over whether this is even possible. And the Ukrainians have said, why not freeze the current line of contact? Well, Putin's not happy with that.
I'm sure he's not. And Shelby, very quickly before we let you go, have those drone attacks that I know you are dealing with every day and every night, have they slowed down?
No, they haven't. We're under drone attack, not yet in Kiev tonight, but other parts of Ukraine. And I just want to stress that when we come under attack from drones, it'll be hundreds of these large kamikaze Shahed drones, which are the size of cars, that are purely meant to terrorize Ukrainians and fly into civilian buildings every night. Imagine if another city like New York or London was facing something like 500, 600 kamikaze drones raining down on it, apart from missiles. And as you know, I said earlier this week, when I was in the east of Ukraine, we have FPV Russian drones hitting civilian cars close range.
Yes.
But across Ukraine, no, attacks continue tonight. We'll see how they unfold, and I will keep you posted tomorrow.
All right, Shelby, you always do such a great job, courageous, and also please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina.
It's time now for our outrage of the day. All right, check this one out. Democratic Congressman from Louisiana, Cleo Fields, recently bought 6 figures worth of Netflix stock. According to House financial disclosure documents, those purchases were between October 31st and November 20th. Interesting timing. Remember why? Well, last Friday, Netflix says it was buying Warner Brothers for nearly $83 billion. Ironically, Netflix's stock has dropped since Fields made the purchase. Oops. The stock dipping by about 15 points since October 31st. Now, there has been a bipartisan push to ban congressional stock trading. I wonder why. But the votes are not there to make it happen. I also wonder why. All right. And it's the hypocrisy of socialism. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used campaign dollars to fund her lavish trip to Puerto Rico. According to FEC filings, AOC spent more than $15,000 for lodging on the island between July 1st and September 30th. More than $10 grand spent on meals between August 25th and September 29th. And that wasn't all. Here she is, having some fun at a Bad Bunny concert. Her campaign spent more than $23,000 on a venue rental where Bad Bunny performed. It's unclear, though, if those expenses were related to the concert. This comes as AOC has denounced gentrification of Puerto Rico. Her campaign manager says she supports the local causes of the island. And coming up, the man accused of killing Charlie Kirk was in a Utah courtroom today. That when the record continues. Stay there.
What's gold is new again, pardon the pun. But considering gold has been used as currency since around 550 BC, it has been on fire the past year. I'm here with Daniel Boston, the founder of Preserve Gold. Why is gold so stable and such a good investment for many people?
Take the central bank, for example, the Federal Reserve. They print money out of thin air, and then they take that printed money to go buy hard assets like gold to protect themselves against the very risks that they're creating. So I always tell people, don't do what the big players are telling you to do. Do what they're doing themselves.
Yeah, watch what they're doing.
That's correct.
Okay. If people are interested in investing with Preserve Gold, how do they get started?
Text Newsmax to 50505 to get your free information and up to $15,000 in free gold and silver with a qualified purchase. That's right. Text Newsmax to 50505.
All right. No way you can miss it.
Hi, I'm Ben Cozy. Isn't holiday travel a pain in the neck? You're cramped, uncomfortable, and forget about getting any rest. There's nothing cozy about airplane seats or hard plastic benches, and those so-called travel pillows, they just don't cut it. You don't need another travel pillow. You need Be Cozy, the world's most comfortable neck pillow. Trapped in the middle seat? Wrap Be Cozy around your neck to stop chin drop, bobblehead napping. Smashed up against the window? Fold Be Cozy over and tuck it onto your shoulder for super side support. Frequent flyer miles got you sitting aisle? Turn Be Cozy to the side for the perfect pillow position. Hey, everyone wants to be cozy, so get the world's most comfortable travel neck pillow and be cozy like me, Ben Cozy. You get to be cozy. Everyone gets a Be Cozy. Only Be Cozy has patented overlapping arms so you get double support and the comfort you need in any seat on any trip. Go online right now and get this special holiday offer. Buy one Be Cozy, get one 50% off. So don't wait. Get yours now.
Hey everybody, Howard Garrett, the Dirt Doctor here. You know, homeowners, farmers, and ranchers don't want to worry about frozen water supplies. I don't either. Freeze Miser product helps me avoid those. It installs in minutes and activates when the water temperature falls below 37 degrees. The Freeze Miser even works in extreme freezing weather. No batteries or electricity, and it's made in the USA. Available at your favorite retailer or at freezemiser.com. It's the Freeze Miser, and it works.
Every day, bumps and bangs happen. Bruises are optional. Used daily, dermatologist-recommended Dermen Moisturizing Bruise Cream can help restore your skin's natural barrier and reduce the appearance of bruises. If you have mature skin and bruise easily, get Dermen Moisturizing Bruise Cream in the first aid aisle and get back to having way too much fun.
Tyler Robinson, the man accused of killing Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, appeared in court for the first time in person today since he was taken into custody nearly 3 months ago. Tyler Robinson has been charged with aggravated murder and multiple felonies in the September 10th assassination of Charlie Kirk during an event at Utah Valley University. The court heard arguments about the level of access that may be granted to the media amid growing concerns about the lack of transparency surrounding the case, something which has given rise to a spate of conspiracy theories around Kirk's death. Even Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica Kirk, has expressed concern, asking why the suspect is being shielded from cameras when her husband was killed in front of a crowd. Robinson has not yet entered a plea. Foreign tourists could be required to disclose 5 years of their social media history before entering the U.S., according to the Trump administration's new plan. Foreign Affairs correspondent Alex Salvi joins me from Washington. Alex.
Yeah, Katrina, some rather significant changes could be on the horizon. Phone numbers, email addresses, even social media profiles that could all be part of this larger review process for those that are trying to visit the United States. Now, a proposal filed by Customs and Border Protection this week would apply to travelers from 42 countries that fall under what's known as the Visa Waiver Program. These tourists are allowed to stay in the country for up to 90 days with an electronic travel authorization. However, they'll have to turn over important details, including up to 10 years worth of personal information, including their online history. Other details could include family history, including birth dates and places of residence for parents, spouses, siblings, and children. President Trump, well, as of right now, he's throwing his support behind the idea, saying that the measure is aimed at keeping Americans safe. He's also shaking off the concerns raised by privacy advocates and travel industry groups who argue that these requirements could affect tourism.
No, we're doing so well. We just want people to come over here and safe. We want safety, we want security, we want to make sure we're not letting the wrong people come into our country. We're getting rid of a lot of bad ones from jails, from mental institutions, drug dealers.
The Trump administration is already following similar rules when it comes to vetting visa applicants, H-1B foreign workers, and international students. Now, this new guidance, it must first be approved, but it could go into effect within weeks, Katrina, and could result in longer wait times if it's ultimately passed.
All right, Alex Salvi, you know, I think it's interesting because we hear so often when a tragedy happens, people saying, you know, if you see something, say something. If only someone had looked in that person's social media, if there was something questionable. And it sounds like maybe this is a bit of what the Trump administration is trying to do to get ahead of any potential problems. And I think a lot of people feel like it may sound like an invasion of privacy, but these days you can't be too safe.
Look, how many times has there been a disaster of whatever degree? It could be what we saw recently here in Washington. We've seen it in schools, whatever it may be. How many times have you looked back and said there were signs this could have been prevented? This is one way I think that the administration is looking at this and saying, you're right, there are additional steps that we could take. Now, of course, this applies to tourism in particular, a little bit different than visa, but you bring up a good point. It's the idea that the administration is taking more precautions on these legal forms of immigration, including visas, including tourism. So it's just an added degree of safe rail to make sure that none of these things happen again.
Yeah, and if someone has nothing to hide, then they would have no problem supplying it. Alex Salvi, thank you, and congratulations on your promotion.
Oh, thank you very much, Katrina.
All right. And days of heavy rain due to an atmospheric river that hit Washington state is causing potentially catastrophic, life-threatening flooding, according to the National Weather Service. Water rescues and evacuations are already underway in the western part of the state, including for residents living along the Snohomish and the Skagit rivers, I hope I said that right, which continue to rise. Up to 100,000 residents may be ordered to evacuate as conditions worsen. Governor Bob Ferguson has declared a state of emergency. And coming up, not all heroes wear capes. Some carry dogs in backpacks. That when the record continues.
You know, I think the biggest selling point for Newsmax is we're not doing the same boring, predictable news. You flip through the other channels, you got these high-paid hosts. They say the same thing every night. You know what they're going to say. It's a little different.
Derriere, caboose, booty, badunkadunk. No matter what you call it, if you have hemorrhoids, your tushy is no laughing matter. So don't use a cream that treats your rear end like a joke. Get serious relief with Recticare Advanced Hemorrhoidal Cream. Recticare Advanced is seriously effective with 2 powerful medicines for rapid dual-action relief, soothing the uncomfortable swelling, itching, and pain of your hemorrhoids. For serious hemorrhoid relief for your buns, get Recticare Advanced.
I'm a martial artist, a skydiver, a pilot, and all of them require your feet to work. Get up in the morning and it felt like I was standing on marbles on my heel. When I went into the Good Feet store, the fitting was personalized. It was all about me. You put in the arch supports and your day becomes better and the sun shines, the unicorns run by, and it's a good life. I'm Randy and that's my Good Feet story.
See for yourself with a free personalized arch support fitting at the Good Feet store.
Hi, Leslie, the deal-loving llama here. I just got a great deal on new flooring. Lumber Liquidators has the top brands of flooring from Dream Home Laminate to Bellawood Exotics with the best warranties and at incredible prices, up to 60% less than others. Visit your local store or lumberliquidators.com. Worth a drive!
There are only a few men I'd trust with my life. 2 of them built this wallet. I've known the guys behind Proof for nearly 20 years, and we've been through hell and back together. When they told me they were building the wallet, I just said, bill me now, I'm in. This isn't some fashion piece. This isn't just some trend. These wallets are a direct reflection of the kind of men who built it. It's built to last, built to function, and designed to carry everything you need and more. If anything happens to it, they'll take care of it. No questions, no fine print. If you knew the guys who created this wallet, you wouldn't carry anything else. Go check them out, because they built this thing right.
Larry was in a really bad accident and broke his neck in the line of duty.
I get a phone call early one morning from the Tunnel Towers Foundation. Said, we're going to provide you and your family with a smart home. At that time, I just almost just passed out. I just couldn't believe it.
They heard his story, which means someone's out there listening.
By giving $11 a month, you're joining us on our mission to do good. Go to T2T.org now.
Think of all the places that could expose you to identity theft. If something happens, LifeLock provides a dedicated US-based restoration specialist with expertise to make the right calls and take the right steps to fix your case start to finish. In fact, we're so confident restoration is guaranteed or your money back. Don't face identity theft alone. Protect your future and finances with the leader in identity theft protection, LifeLock. For the threats you can't control.
There's nothing worse than losing your dog before their time.
That's why I created Dr. Marty Nature's Blend, designed to help dogs with everything from digestive issues to itching, even moving better.
Nature's Blend works because it's freeze-dried. So instead of destroying the nutrients with high heat, they all get right into your dog's body.
Take it from a veterinarian with over 50 years of experience saving dogs' lives. I have never seen a food make this much impact on a dog's health.
For a limited time, get up to 54% off Dr. Marty Nature's Blend, plus a free gift with our special TV offer. Call or go to drmartypets.com/TV.
Sponsored by Dr. Marty Nature's Blend, the health of fresh food with the convenience of kibble. Visit drmartypets.com/TV.
All right, welcome back. This story is worth the wait. A volunteer at an animal shelter in New York City is saving the day with creativity and a little bit of adventure. Each week, Brian Reisberg spends the day with one dog who is looking for their forever home. He carries that dog around the city in a backpack, look how cute, with a sign that says, "Adopt me." Reisberg films his journey and then posts them on social media. He tries to show off each of the dog's personality. So far, he has taken 11 dogs out on these expeditions. Looks like it's a winning strategy. 10 of them have been adopted. All right, that is all the time we have. I'm Katrina Szish in for Greta Van Susteren. The Chris Salcedo Show is up next.